Victoria Helen McFarlane, more widely known as Helen Duncan, was born on the 25th of November 1897 in the small town of Callander, Scotland. Her father was Archibald McFarlane, a cabinet maker or slater, and her mother, Isabella Rattray, was a housewife, as was typical of the time. Archibald and Isabella were your ordinary, everyday working people, yet from a young age, Helen's spiritual side was clear. While at school, it was reported that young Helen would behave hysterically and scare other students with her ominous prophecies. Although this didn't really get her into trouble, her mother, Isabella, who was a member of the local Presbyterian church, was not impressed, to say the least. Just like most working-class children, Helen left school around the age of 12. After this, she found work at the Dundee Royal Infirmary. She lived with her parents until she married Henry Duncan in 1916, when she was 20 years old. Her husband was a cabinet maker who had served and been wounded during the First World War. Luckily for Helen, Henry Duncan was supportive of her paranormal talents. Following the marriage, Helen got pregnant a total of 12 times, but as a result of miscarriages and infant deaths, in the end, only 6 out of 12 children survived. To help support the large family, Helen took on a part-time job in a local bleach factory. When she got home, she took care of domestic duties. During this time, she continued to keep in touch with her spiritual abilities and even began to offer seances in order to earn extra cash. Helen was now a physical medium who could conjure up and materialize the spirits of the recently deceased. After years of demonstrating her abilities on a small scale, during the 1930s and 1940s, she began to travel all around Britain with hundreds attending her seances. These sessions took place in all sorts of places, with people from all walks of life, from spiritualists to working folk, and even some academics. During Helen's seances, she would go into a trance state. After this, ectoplasm would come out of her mouth and take on the form of dead loved ones. The recently deceased would be able to touch and communicate with their earthly relatives. This brought great comfort to many grieving families, especially due to the huge loss of life following the First and Second World War. Many testimonies and stories surrounding Helen Duncan's seances exist, yet one that stands out from the rest is from a man named Vincent Woodcock. His wife had died a few weeks prior and decided to go to a demonstration in the company of his sister-in-law. Woodcock recounted that during the seance, Helen Duncan slipped into a trance, and from her mouth a strange spirit began to emerge. It wasn't long until the matter took on the form of his deceased wife, and then she asked them to both stand up. Woodcock's wife then took off her wedding ring, grabbed her younger sister's hand, and slipped it on her finger, saying, "It is my wish that this takes place for the sake of my little girl." Following this, Woodcock married the younger sister of his deceased wife, and a year later, they returned for another session. Again, the dead wife appeared, blessing the couple's marriage and love. Many testimonies like these surrounding Helen Duncan's practices exist. Some of these mention how their lives were changed for the better. However, some people were determined to bring her down and prove that she was a fake medium. In 1928, a photographer named Harvey Metcalf attended various seances at Helen Duncan's house. While there, Harvey quickly took photographs with flash on in order to find out the truth behind the alleged spirits that were materializing. The images he produced supposedly revealed that the spirits were all fake. For example, one was simply a doll made from a painted papier-mâché mask with an old sheet. 3 years later, her practices came to the attention of the London Spiritualist Alliance, who subsequently examined Helen Duncan's method. At this time, it was widely believed by her critics that she regurgitated a cotton cloth in order to create the effect of an ectoplasm. Yet, investigations into this had differing results. Some even suggested that she hid the cloth in her nose, as she was known to have nosebleeds during seances. On one occasion, she was persuaded to swallow a tablet of methylene blue before a seance. This way, any regurgitated object would be blue, thus proving the truth behind the ectoplasm. Nevertheless, accounts varied, with one stating that no ectoplasm appeared. Meanwhile, another claimed that she still produced clean, white ectoplasm. Up until now, it was unclear just how legitimate her practices were. Despite this, people from around the country were still attending her seances. It was around this time that psychic researcher Harry Price paid Duncan £50 to perform a number of test seances with the aim of proving that she was a fraud. In a report, Price wrote this regarding Duncan. At the conclusion of the fourth seance, we led the medium to a settee and called for the apparatus. At the sight of it, the lady promptly went into a trance. She recovered, but refused to be x-rayed. Her husband went up to her and told her it was painless. She jumped up and gave him a smashing blow on the face, which sent him reeling. Then, she went for Dr. William Brown, who was present. He dodged the blow. Mrs. Duncan, without the slightest warning, dashed out into the street, had an attack of hysteria, and began to tear her seance garment to pieces. She clutched the railings and screamed and screamed. Her husband tried to pacify her. It was useless. I leave the reader to visualize the scene. A 17-stone woman, clad in black sateen tights, locked to the railings, screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd collected, and the police arrived. The medical men with us explained the position and prevented them from fetching the ambulance. We got her back into the laboratory, and at once she demanded to be x-rayed. In reply, Dr. William Brown turned to Mr. Duncan and asked him to turn out his pockets. He refused and would not allow us to search him. There is no question that his wife had passed him the cheesecloth in the street. However, they gave us another seance, and the control said we could cut off a piece of teleplasm when it appeared. The sight of half a dozen men, each with a pair of scissors, waiting for the word, was amusing. It came, and we all jumped. One of the doctors got hold of the stuff and secured a piece. The medium screamed, and the rest of the teleplasm went down her throat. This time, it wasn't cheesecloth. It proved to be paper soaked in white of egg and folded into a flattened tube. Could anything be more infantile than a group of grown men wasting time, money, and energy on the antics of a fat female crook? Price also published photographs revealing fake ectoplasm made from cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and cut-out heads from magazine covers, which she claimed were spirits. Furthermore, Duncan's former maid, Mary McGinley, confessed to having aided Duncan in her mediumship tricks, and even Duncan's own husband admitted that the ectoplasm materializations were the result of regurgitation. In spite of this, her seances would continue for years to come. The next issue encountered by Helen Duncan was in 1933, when during a seance, the lights were turned on, revealing the spirit to have been made from a stockinette undervest. Her audience was angered by this. For them, Duncan was a fraud and decided to call the police. Following this, she was prosecuted and convicted of fraudulent mediumship at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court trial. The conviction came with a £10 fine, about £720 today. Nevertheless, her practices continued. When the Second World War broke out, demand for her services greatly increased, with anxious relatives restless to find out the fate of their loved ones or communicate with the ones they had lost. Up until now, authorities hadn't really taken much notice of her, apart from the fine back in 1933. However, in late November 1941, a few days after the sinking of the HMS Barham, Duncan claimed that the spirit of a dead sailor materialized and told her what had occurred. Yet, the interesting thing was that only close relatives of those who had passed away knew the fate of the ship. In order to keep British morale high, the Navy had censored the sinking and warned those informed to not discuss the information with anyone. So, as the Navy believed there was no way Duncan could have known, they started to take interest in her activities. In January 1944, Duncan held a séance in a private house in Portsmouth. 2 lieutenants from the Navy attended, yet they were not impressed. In fact, they were offended by her fraudulence. Lieutenant Worth recalled how a white cloth figure appeared behind the curtains, claiming to be his deceased aunt. However, his aunt was alive and well. The same thing happened later on, this time claiming to be his sister, but she was also alive. Worth, disgusted by this, reported Duncan and her accomplices to the police. A few days later, on the 19th of January, undercover policemen launched a sudden raid on her place of work. Worth was amongst those present, and he even tried to grab the ectoplasm, which he believed was a white sheet. But it dematerialized too quickly. A search of the premises led to no white sheets being found, making some wonder if it was a real spirit or how she pulled it off. As a result of the raid, Helen Duncan was arrested and taken before Portsmouth magistrates, where she was charged with vagrancy. Yet, this was a minor crime, with the maximum fine being just 5 shillings, with no further punishment. However, it seemed as though authorities were intent on giving her a larger sentence, as they refused her bail. Instead, she was moved to a notorious women's prison in London called Holloway. It was known for holding Victorian murderers and traitors, most of whom were destined to be hanged. Having Duncan in jail gave authorities more time to determine the best charge to bring against her. First, they decided to change the vagrancy charge for conspiracy, which at the time could lead to a death sentence. However, this was later changed when the case was referred to the Old Bailey. The charge was amended to witchcraft. Under an ancient act from 1735, Helen Duncan was accused of pretending to exercise or use human conjuration that through the agency of Helen Duncan's spirits of deceased dead persons should appear to be present. This attitude towards Duncan by the prosecution might have been due to the rough situation in which the country found itself, but also as the establishment was paranoid and afraid that she would reveal other classified information, such as that concerning D-Day. The trial of Helen Duncan for fraudulent witchcraft caused widespread attention and controversy around the country. The trial was complicated for the prosecution due to the lack of physical evidence. Instead, witnesses were called to the stand one by one. Of course, some claimed that she was a fraud. Meanwhile, others were convinced that she was an authentic medium with legitimate powers. During the trial, Duncan even attempted to demonstrate her abilities in front of the jury to prove that she was no fraud. Yet, the judge didn't allow this. After 30 minutes deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for contravening the 1735 Witchcraft Act, but was acquitted on all other charges. As a result, Duncan was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. Upon hearing her sentence, She cried out, "I have done nothing. Is there a God?" Helen Duncan was one of the last people convicted under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. This, along with just how famous the case was at the time, led to her being referred to by many as Britain's last witch. The Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, criticised the whole proceeding as a waste of time and a misuse of court resources. In a memo to the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, he stated that the charge was obsolete tomfoolery. After an appeal to the House of Lords, which was denied, Duncan was sent back to the infamous Holloway prison. Up and down the country, her supporters believed that the sentence was a total injustice. Apparently, her prison wardens felt the same, and it's been claimed that they decided against locking her cell door, always leaving it open. In 1951, the Witchcraft Act was repealed and became integrated in the Fraudulent Mediums Act. Helen Duncan's trial was a contributing factor to this change. After Duncan completed her sentence, she apparently promised to stop conducting seances. However, it's clear that there were no meaning behind her words. 11 years later, in 1956, another raid occurred while she was in the middle of a seance. Again, she was arrested. Helen died on the 6th of December 1956, aged 59, in her home in Edinburgh, due to ill health, likely due to her obesity and heart problems. However, certain spiritualists claim that her death was a direct result of the police raid in November 1956. Helen Duncan was in a trance state at the moment of the raid. While in this state, nobody can touch you, as if they do, the ectoplasm can return too quickly to the medium's body, causing serious damage. Of course, the police were ignorant of this, and apparently, as a result, Duncan was left with 2 second-degree burns on her stomach. She is said to have spent time in hospital and then rested at home. She died just 5 weeks after the police raid. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Helen Duncan, Britain's last witch. If you enjoyed, leave me a like and a comment down below. If you're new, why not subscribe? Let me know if you think she was a real medium or if she was a fraud. If you have any suggestions, please leave me a comment down below or send me an email, which can be found in the description. Anyway, that's all from me, so I will see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks!